All right. Do you want to hide your video, or you've got it set up on your side and we don't have to care?
Oh,
All right,
Michael,
so-
Michael, do you want a local audio from me, or are you getting good enough audio from this? You're happy? I'm set for it. So if you want me to, it's really easy. I'll just set it up. Yeah. All right. Check, check, check. Okay, cool.
All right. I'll clap to kick us off. Hi there, I'm Salim Ismail, and welcome to the Salim Ismail Podcast. Super thrilled today to have with us Adam Levine. Adam, welcome.
Thank you, Salim. It's good to be here.
So I've got a million kind of topics to cover with you. So we're going to dive right into it. But first of all, you're one of the old guard in the blockchain space. And I want to get a sense and give the audience a sense of how did you get into the space, when, and what got you what twigged you to get into this. So give us a bit of background.
Sure. So I first got interested in the concept of money as something other than things that I would spend on stuff in about 2009, in the kind of aftermath of the global financial crisis, so-called, and that then led me down a whole bunch of different rabbit holes, one of which was learning how money works, and that led me to then start looking for alternatives to how money could work in kind of a new technological era that we were already in and increasingly have been in. So in 2011, I first got introduced to Bitcoin. I started a number of podcasts. My life has kind of been a combination of entrepreneurial efforts on one side and then journalistic efforts on the other side, primarily focused on disruptive technologies, which I see really as a way to kind of empower humanity. And to take things that are typically, when we talk about disruption, what we're talking about is something that's either expensive or difficult to do, which is then made easier and thus more accessible or cheaper. So more people can then do it. And I think that leads people down the path towards more autonomy, where they can be more self-reliant. And that's something that's super important to me in my life. And it's something that I really think is important for everyone, and want to try to provide kind of solutions for that. So all of those things led me to Bitcoin. Bitcoin was a very interesting early ecosystem when I first got involved. I created a number of podcasts pseudonymously. And then in 2013, I created 2 podcasts, one of which lasted a week, but got popular and then imploded. And then another one called Let's Talk Bitcoin, which I started several days after the implosion of that prior one, and built on that along with Andreas Antonopoulos and Stephanie Murphy. We recently ended that show. I'm just in the final steps of winding down the companies associated with it and stuff like that. But we had a run of about 9.5 years. And we were for a long time the longest running podcast in Bitcoin, mostly focused on the philosophy and sort of the implications of when it comes to all of these different technologies. So a little bit more into my background. So that podcast quickly turned into a podcast network by the end of 2013. In early 2014, then, as part of the network, I started doing experiments with many of the kind of early non-currency token potentials. I launched the first tokenized rewards program. I launched the first tokenized vending machines. I launched the first tokenized token control access forums, and a whole bunch of other types of things like that. And really, it wasn't that I came up with these ideas. It was that I was well positioned with an audience of a couple tens of thousands of people who were really interested in going along on that journey. And it allowed us to do many, many things first, which then led me to start a technology company called Tokenly, which then built out infrastructure for many of the use cases that I needed in terms of all the things that I was talking about, as well as many other types of projects that we worked with, like the early tokenized games and stuff like that. Since then, I've also been a managing editor over at CoinDesk, where I built their podcast network. And most recently, I've been kind of sucked into and entirely focused on the world of generative AI and the implications that surround all of the disruption that's going on in that space right now.
So there's a ton there. I'm going to I'll drill into a couple of these, right? First of all, what's your view on the future of Bitcoin in terms of that versus the rest of the altcoins? Austin Hill and others will call everything else shitcoins. Are you a Bitcoin maximalist, or do you think there's room for many cryptocurrencies?
Yeah, I really kind of reject all of the labels that exist out there. My basic sense is that to the extent that you're identifying with one particular group or another is to the extent that you're locking your brain into a way of thinking that makes it so that you experience cognitive dissonance or just straight up pain. when you get evidence, information, right, that goes against the thing that you're supposed to believe is part of your identity. So I actually consider myself kind of the consummate outsider on all of these things. I'm definitely a Bitcoin fan, let's call it that. But I'm not heavily invested really in any of these cryptocurrencies. Mostly I'm interested in them for the potential alternatives and competition that they offer. So so I don't consider myself a Bitcoin maximalist. And so like, what's the future of this stuff? I think there's two futures. One future is the one where nothing really changes. Bitcoin never becomes important, and the world, when it reboots its monetary system in largely a new iteration of what we've seen basically since Bretton Woods, or really the gold exchange standards before that even. From kind of that. I think the other alternative, and the one that personally is what keeps me interested in the technologies and sort of the potential behind the Bitcoin blockchain in particular, but not exclusively, is the idea that Bitcoin can serve and is well positioned, better positioned than really any other thing in our world today, to serve as a new kind of reserve asset that has many of the attractive attributes of gold in terms of limiting the ability to expand the money supply, which has all kinds of negative consequences, which we're now seeing play out today, but which really in practice have been playing out over the last 80 or 90 years already. We're just seeing it more acutely today. So you can take kind of all of the advantages that was provided by the gold system, but you can get rid of most of the disadvantages that allowed people to, even during days where gold standards were actually used, to get around the controls that they provided through a variety of obfuscation techniques, and then also by nature of the government being able to suspend redemption, which was done repeatedly over the last couple hundred years, and which propped up the banking system in ways that were very negative for normal people.
I mean, there's two things for me that always got me super excited by Bitcoin. One is the fact that it cannot be controlled by a government, right? And that is incredibly fascinating, that you have, for the first time, a model that can't be prevented, and as long as you have internet access. We did a podcast on this a couple of years ago, and we one of the things that blew my mind is that if the internet goes down, Bitcoin still works. And it was like, poof, like there's no stopping this thing at that point. So that was pretty fascinating. So if we move on from cryptocurrencies, talk about where do you go with the rest of metaverse, blockchain? Because and tell us a bit about PixelMind. How did that get started, and what got you excited about that?
Sure. So kind of again, really high level, glossing over lots of nuance, but just to keep it a little bit more concise than I typically would. I think that blockchains are a really useful way to keep track of who owns what stuff on the internet. And that's a really, really useful feature for money. It's something that's essentially required in the modern era, in my opinion. But it's also really useful for a bunch of other types of things. There's lots and lots of stuff that we have bad abstractions for of ownership on the internet, and which blockchains really do solve in a fundamental way. So I think there's lots and lots of potential out there for use cases to emerge and for uses to emerge. I think that the biggest challenge that's faced by the blockchain space, and this is not a new problem, this has been true since literally my very first awareness of it with the very first sort of altcoins that were created, and Bitcoin also too, is that because everything is about ownership on the internet, that means that you can own stuff. And if you can own stuff, that means that you can speculate on stuff, right? Because it means you can transfer ownership of things. So everything in the cryptocurrency world or the token world is inherently financialized to the degree that people are interested in speculating on it. And that creates a bunch of distortions, which make it so that things that are really good ideas that would be really useful in practice can often get lost in kind of the mix, even just amongst themselves. Like, again, like, is the value of Bitcoin today really worth $16,000 or $17,000? I don't know. There's so much speculation in the market relative to the amount of utility that it's hard to tell. And you can take that same type of viewpoint and you can apply it to really any project that's out there and ask the same thing. And what you'll almost always find is that people are betting on the future relevance of these technologies more so than they're buying things for current relevance today. And that just means that it just creates an environment that is so attractive to a certain type of promoter that it muddies the water in ways that make it actually more difficult, I think, for many of the technological innovations and the true applications that really are meaningful to succeed. And also it provides a path for people who would be disrupted by by these new technologies and by successes in these new technologies to say, oh, well, this isn't anything important. All this is actually a speculation. The true answer is, of course, that it's both. And that, I think that it muddies the water in ways that are difficult to surpass. And I think that that's a large reason why we haven't seen adoption of cryptocurrencies and token type solutions in the same way that we saw adoption of the internet. I think that it's a slower path because it's more complicated, and it's more complicated just insofar as that you don't know if someone wants you to use it because they're going to make money off of you using it, greater fool theory type stuff, or because it's actually just really cool, right? Because the internet, like it was so useful and not financialized, right? That's why it grew so fast once it got past its tipping point. And we haven't seen that yet with cryptocurrency, in my opinion.
It's a great point that you made. I'm just going to summarize this because this is a really key one. The speculative nature of crypto is clouding a lot of the real utility that's going to come out. So we got to get through that cloud before you can get to the real value. It's a very powerful observation. Where do you go with this as we move into the metaverse? Because now you get into identity management and proof of access kind of mechanisms, proof of attendance mechanisms, all sorts of new constructs become available. And give us a sense of what excites you about the metaverse and why you've gotten into that.
So I have done a variety of projects with the metaverse. I was involved with the very earliest days of sort of like Decentraland, back when it was a dot map that you would point your computer at and you would mine in the very first version back in 2013 or 2014. I have been an early adopter of virtual reality technologies. I am not that excited about it at this point. I think that these technologies have a long way to go. I think that the excitement around them comes largely from technology enthusiasts rather than from actual users. And I think that that's hard. A big part of this, though, has to do with compute, right? Like the hardware that you need in order to, specifically talking about virtual reality, right? The hardware that you need, there's been, I think Meta just announced late last year that they had invested and lost $10 billion in their efforts so far on that. And that may wind up being an incredibly good use of funds if this winds up being the future, or it may wind up being a bad use of funds if it winds up being something that they invested a bunch of money into and then can't actually get meaningful users for. To be honest with you, I look at the metaverse a lot like I look at people who are interested primarily in colonizing Mars. I think that it is in large part a desire to escape our current reality and to escape the problems that we have today in the real world. And it's not to say there's no utility to it. It's not to say that there's no future of it, but it is to say that I think that the path towards creating entirely new worlds and new civilizations is actually significantly harder and less beneficial than trying to resolve the problems that exist in our world today that we're actually trying to escape with these things.
I think I agree with all of that. I tell you what has gotten me excited about it, and it comes from Michael Janssen, who we both know very well.
Yeah.
One of the things when he took me down into this rabbit hole, he was like, hey, you can have a different avatar for every one of your Discord projects and metaverse identities. And I was like, why would one do that? And he was like, you get to experience life in a different way. And one of the I'm fascinated by metaphysics and philosophy type of stuff. And one of the things that I find fascinating is in Hollywood, an actor gets to have a different lifetime per role that they take on, right? You do a movie and you're living that character, breathing that character for the duration of the filming of that movie. Then you take on that costume and you put on another one, and you're essentially experiencing multiple Buddhist type lifetimes in the same virtualized environment. And the metaverse allows you to take it to that next level. And that I found totally fascinating.
Yeah, I would actually agree with that. I think really the challenge that I see metaverse is facing today, and one that I don't necessarily see a short path out of, is that there's nothing stopping anyone else from creating a new metaverse, right? So especially to the extent we're talking about tokenized metaverses and we're talking about ones that have ownership as a key part, I think we've seen the same thing there. I think that we have largely seen an investment, a speculative frenzy, which, I mean, I should back up a second and say that the reason why we have these speculative frenzies and manias really in all of these new technology categories is not actually because of the new technology categories. It's not because of that. It's because we live in a world that's driven largely by speculative manias, which is largely driven by monetary policy decisions made at sort of the highest level of governments around the world, and stuff like that. So I mean, like that's the underlying part, is that the macroeconomic environment is essentially the playing field, right? It's the game board that we all have to exist on, that all of these technologies have to find their way on, that everyone as individuals has to kind of make their lives on. And if the topography of that area is fundamentally not conducive to creating stable, systems, because it itself is not stable, then it kind of doesn't matter what you create on it. What you need to do at an underlying level is solve for the, is level the playing field, right? Is take the playing field that has all these inequities built into it and make it such, not that everyone is a winner or everyone is equal, but that the opportunity there to become a winner is obvious and is available to anyone who wishes to pursue it. And that's kind of the thing that I obsess over these days. And were I not so interested, but it's a huge problem, right? Like, how do you solve that problem? I don't know how you solve that problem. I have lots of ideas, but it's hard.
One of the things that we've noticed, and coming from my time at Singularity University, we're looking at exponential technologies, and one of the incredibly important and most powerful dynamics and attributes of exponential technologies is they democratize.
Yes.
Right. And the blockchain is open source and free. And for the first time in human history, advanced technologies are very cheap. AI is cheap, solar energy is cheap, sensors are cheap, etc. We've never had this before, because in the history of humanity, advanced technologies always cost a lot. And only a government or a big corporate lab could afford to do R&D, launch new products and services. So this is an incredibly powerful new world. How we structure that and make that available, I think, becomes interesting. But now anybody can play, as you say, with the same opportunity level as others in a metaverse type environment. And that's fine. One of the things that keeps tweaking onto me around this is the protein folding internet game they had. Yeah. Who would be the best protein folder in the world? And it turned out to be a hairdresser from the north of England.
Yeah.
Who had zero experience in biotech, but just her brain just works so well. She was the leading protein folder in the world. And I think the models like the metaverse or the internet give us the ability to source those folks that you could never find in any other way.
I think the interesting part about, so I agree with everything that you just said there, but I think that there's another side to it as well, which is something that I increasingly think a lot about. Again, like personally, I identify as a lowercase L libertarian. More so than anything else, were we to put me on a sort of political or ideological spectrum.
Wait, what's the difference in your mind between lowercase and uppercase?
Uppercase L in the United States refers to the Libertarian Party, which is not actually libertarian in practice. Lowercase L refers to the principles behind the concept of libertarianism.
Got it. Done.
Which basically just
means,
in which case
I would be very much a lowercase libertarian myself.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we live in an era where basically any word that means anything,
you just labeled yourself. Remember at the early on, you said you don't like labels. So I'm just going to just point out that little irony.
Yes, but it's lowercase L, so it's not actually affiliation with. I mean, so awesome. Like I said, I find myself most closely affiliated to that type of thinking, which really is, again, a self-reliance way of thinking, and a way of thinking that recognizes that there are consequences to actions that might seem on their face to be just beneficial, right? Like, take any given government program, take any given government spending, any type of thing like that. Effectively, what you're doing is you're saying, hey, we're going to take money out of the system or dilute the amount of money that's in the system. We're going to go after this specific outcome that we want. And we think that that's worth doing. But what's typically left unsaid is that, okay, and then here's the 10 times number of things that you're not thinking about that will be second order or third order effects of the thing that you're doing, which in practice usually winds up, like being worse than having done nothing at all if you take the totality of the impact into account. And that's kind of it. I think that there's a humility that comes with appreciating that there are no easy answers to real problems. And that to the extent that something is a real problem, it's something where taking any action at all can actually wind up having a very negative effect. So that's really what it is. It's really a way to say that I'm very skeptical of centralizations of power. In our world today, government represents one of the largest and most significant centralizations of power. But it's not the exclusive one. You can look at religion. It's exactly the same thing. Yep. Spirituality, that's great. Organized religion, those are typically concentrations of power. And you can look at really any structure that exists out there today, and you can say these things. So it's to say that I think that there are well, anyways, we don't have to go further down this rabbit hole.
Well, I think it's actually a really powerful one, because I've done a bit of research into this, again, using my other hats, and we have this modality, and you could call it centralized versus decentralized. I've been using a framing of male versus female archetype, right? And centralized, structured command and control, top-down hierarchical systems are really good for managing and governing in a scarcity-based world, because you want to have people going out and grabbing stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And value comes from scarcity. Almost every business in the world is based on scarcity, right? And what's magical is the technology is bringing us abundance, which is why you need a much more of a female archetype to manage the world in an abundance era. We're seeing the emergence of that Burning Man, the maker movement, the DIY movement, the cryptocurrency and blockchain movement, et cetera. And for me, the tension that we're seeing in the world is the difficulty of moving from the centralized systems to decentralized systems, right? Because when you have abundance, you don't want a centralized system. It relates to it as power and tries to hoard it. Middle East oil, Wall Street money. Decentralized systems or female archetypes, when they meet abundance, share it around. And I think that's where the power will come from in the future. How do we get there is the question that many of us are asking.
I think that it is a good question. I think that the way the power structures work today is largely the way that they've worked for most of sort of the modern history of humanity, right? We haven't really seen significant changes to that. I think that, as you said, when you call them exponential technologies, I call them disruptive technologies, but I think we're actually talking about exactly the same thing here.
100%.
Yeah. So what you're talking about is fundamental changes to the practical reality of the world that we live in, fundamental changes to our ability to do certain things, to be empowered in certain ways that typically was not possible or practical. If you look at the history of government, which again, I would argue is one of the most significant centralized power structures that exist in the world today. When you look at that, what you see, particularly in the United States, is a structure that was built with maximal, arguably too much decentralization for the era in which it was constructed. This was an era before telecommunication existed in any form or fashion. And the degree at the federal level, the degree of decentralization, there are literally, hundreds and hundreds of representatives from all over the country who then come together, to create these types of rules. And that is wildly impractical versus just having, hey, here's this guy, and this guy, who's the king, makes decisions. And then, those decisions are carried out by kind of the structure underneath him. So there was already a significant amount of decentralization built in. And that was because the experience that America was founded under came from an entirely centralized system, right? A centralized system that had a king. So if you think about it from that perspective, the system actually is one of the only significant governments in the world that was designed from the ground up and that has protections and documents built around it that are intended to maximize decentralization, to try and avoid the problem of concentrations of power. And I think what we've seen is that it's a system that worked well for a number of years, but which, as time has gone on, even that decentralization has proven insufficient to actually create a functional system. So what I'm really interested in today, I'm not actively working on anything, but intellectually very interested in, is when we look at a system like Bitcoin, when we look at a system like a blockchain in general, what you're looking at is a way for many, many interested stakeholder parties who have different and conflicting interests many times to use a common system to come to consensus on the things that we all agree on, while not allowing anyone or group to make changes that are controversial. And that strikes me as a system that, were we to reboot government today, would be very attractive, because you could basically take all of these power structures and you could abstract them down to much lower levels, where instead of, for example, a federal government being its own entity, a federal government could literally be like a consensus mechanism between the states, and states individually could be consensus mechanisms between local representation.
Right.
And so you could take this structure that, again, was very decentralized at the beginning, but in practice has not succeeded in maintaining its goal, which was to avoid concentrations of power that are then abused, for the benefit of the few against the many. And you could kind of reboot things like that. So these are all, again, I think very dangerous ideas in the world today, because concentrations of power are always going to try and defend themselves, because the advantage for those who benefit from those systems is so significant that why would you not? It's the incentives are clearly
huge.
aligned. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I always found it fascinating because I did a lot of research on the history of the internet, right? If the federal government and the Department of Commerce could go back in time and ban the internet, they would do it in a second because they had no idea what they were approving and the broad downstream implications of it. And thank God they didn't at the time. And you probably know the story, but like an accidental whisk of a pen, they kind of went, yeah, let it go ahead and not, let's not tax it and let it go. And boom, the thing kind of, now the world runs on it, and it's basically the nervous system for the world.
Yeah.
Right? And that, I think, becomes incredibly powerful. It's also, there's also the antiquity of nation states in a globalized world. The pandemic showed us very clearly that we need a global system to navigate this, and we're not going to get that with our current structures and 200 fiat currencies and different types of government, everybody trying to do different things. You need that some kind of global world order, and hopefully something will emerge. Offline, let's talk about that, because I've been looking at what kinds of structures might work. And maybe we can have a separate session just on that with a few others and do some brainstorming around that, which I think would be a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Where do you take this now? Let's move to AI, because you've done a lot of tweeting about that recently. Give us your thoughts on ChatGPT and Stable Diffusion and what's emerging. And what the thing that I'm fascinated by, where will the biggest disruptions hit and when? So first, give us your broader thoughts, and then I'm going to pin you, and I have my views, so we'll have a bun fight over which ones we go after. But give us your general thoughts on the AI stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. So I first started working with AI technologies about 4 or 5 years ago after watching an episode of Silicon Valley, the TV show that talked about had a scene where they were demoing a food discriminator, right? So something that could look at a picture of food and then tell you what kind of food it is. And in this scene, they show a hot dog and it says, that's a hot dog, right? And then they show something else and everybody's like, wow, that's amazing. It can tell that that's a hot dog. And then they show something else and it's like, that's not a hot dog. And they're like, wait, this thing only can tell you if something is or isn't a hot dog. And so so I had kind of an epiphany at that moment and was like, oh, my background is in actually audio engineering and editing and stuff like that, and I'm a pretty obsessive audio editor. And so I was like, oh, I can take these technologies and I can create an AI that is trained to tell me if something is or isn't intentional speech. And if it is intentional speech, then the AI will ignore it. And if it isn't intentional speech, then it can propose different types of actions that it could take, like, for example, silencing it or redoing kind of the amount of a pause to kind of idealize it, which is a lot of work that I was doing at the time. And so that set me down a path towards building my first AI application that involved a kind of long series of events. And I wound up actually using Bitcoin and people in Venezuela to, again, leverage the exponential nature of kind of disruptive technologies to make it so that I could pay to have the work done, which was really kind of training data assistants in such a way where it cost me a fraction of what it would cost me to do it through conventional methods. And at the same time, I was paying people in Venezuela something like 20 to 40 times what they could actually earn locally. And so it was this great kind of win-win. So that was kind of the first patent that I filed in AI around that type of stuff. And then over the years, I worked with a number of other technologies. I wrote a radio drama that was with a very early version of the technology that would become ChatGPT. And just generally explored many of these ideas in ways that were very hobby-based and just kind of, I was just interested in it. And the part to me that was incredible about it was that it allowed us to take work that was sort of the most rote work, right? The work that doesn't require human intuition, intelligence, anything like that. It just requires sort of repetition of tasks, and then make it so that those were things that I could essentially abstract away and could use a computer to do. So if you think about the core of the technology with many of these things, really what we're looking at are fancy autocomplete systems. So when you're typing, something on your phone and it tries to predict the word that you're typing, so you don't have to type the whole thing, that's essentially what's happening, except that with things like ChatGPT, well, not ChatGPT in particular, but the technologies behind ChatGPT, That's instead of completing the word that you're writing, it will write sentences, paragraphs, and we'll do that. And that's amazing because it allows you to effectively eliminate the concept of writer's block.
Yeah.
Where you'll never not have an idea, and the low cost and the low time that it takes to actually generate new ideas is incredibly trivial. I'm actually working on a new podcast right now, particularly about disruption in artificial intelligence and the disruption that it's going to be causing kind of around the world. And I've been using ChatGPT extensively to create long lists of topics to cover and long lists of questions, and basically taking most of the preparation, which would take me personally a long time, and allowing the AI to help me with that in ways that probably is saving me, I'm probably spending 10% of the time on it that I would be were I doing it the traditional way. So there's a huge advantage there. On the imagery side, it's largely the same thing. There was a perception that I think has now been largely dismissed, or is in the process of being dismissed, that the creative technologies were something that were inherently human, and were something that would be the last things that artificial intelligence would actually kind of make inroads into. And I think in practice, what we're seeing is it's exactly the opposite, is that that's actually one of the easiest places, because humans are so prolific in creating all of these materials. And because these AI models really at their core are statistical engines. So they're taking huge, enormous amounts of data, and then they're using that to then predict where you want to go. So people think, oh, hey, I'm asking for a particular image when they type something into, to a particular image generator. But in practice, what they're doing is they're describing, they're providing a caption essentially that would accompany an image on the internet. And then the AI is predicting what the image would look like that would accompany that caption. So again, it's a fancy form of autocomplete that just goes far beyond what we think of as autocomplete. So I can, so you want to, okay. So let me talk just generally about the technologies, unless you want to break in with a question here.
I just want to pause for a second, because I'm finding there's a level of, I like the autocomplete analogy, but I'm finding there's something else going on here, right? When you can say, write to ChatGPT, write me a scene in a Life of Brian modality about a discussion between Trump and Putin, right? It comes out with something actually staggeringly creative that is way past, but I take the vector of autocomplete. If you looked at it as a vector and you kind of go, if you travel further down, that's where you end up. So that part I understand, but there's a level of creativity that's becoming incredible around it, and comparative models I think become really fascinating. So I tried to write a book 20 years ago on the meaning of life, right? And you get into these things of getting stuck between, say, trying to describe existentialism and objectivism. And now I could basically just go, hey, GPT, give me like a 1-paragraph summary of this and a 1-paragraph summary of this, and it'll figure it out. And I could navigate that whole thing in a way that I could never do a million years ago. And I think that becomes incredible. Now we can put frameworks of thought together and let it fill in the blanks. And I think that becomes really fascinating.
So I agree with you on the core premise. And I think that ChatGPT is showing us like a preview of where we're going with this stuff. The real innovation of ChatGPT is less about its ability to, combine influences, which is really what we're talking about there. Again, it has a statistical understanding of, for example, Stephen King, and it has a statistical understanding of Monty Python. And so if you wanted to then put those things together, effectively what it's doing is it's taking two different statistical understandings, it's averaging them together, and then creating the thing that is there, right? So it is autocomplete, because what you're saying is, before ChatGPT, what you would do is you would say, this is 3 paragraphs from a book, from the book The Life of Brian by Monty Python and Stephen King, and then it would put those things together. What ChatGPT has presented, and why I think it's been so incredibly impactful, is that was a way you had to reverse engineer the AI to do what you wanted. You had to start from the end point and then be like, okay, now fill in the blanks of what this will be. And what ChatGPT has been optimized for is it's been optimized to behave like a human. Insofar as how you interact with it. And that interaction, the ability to not have to learn how to speak AI, but rather to have AI be able to speak to you as a human, and then to be able to give you back the functionality that exists within those statistical understandings without that needing to reverse engineer. That's the part that's so powerful about it, and that's such an amplifier. But if you dig into it and you really go looking, for something like that, like trying to write, for example, a book about the meaning of life, I think what you'll find is that it can synthesize other people's understandings. It can synthesize other takes. It won't come up with its own. It doesn't know anything, right? All it knows is what has come before, and that's true for us as humans, but it's not definitive.
Yeah, I think you nailed it when you say it's like statistical models being put together. That's essentially what it's doing, just at a seemingly functional level.
Yeah, the quality is amazing.
The quality is unbelievable.
It's astonishing.
There was this incredible thread I saw last week of somebody who asked it to do research on the doctoral thesis that they themselves did, and it made up fake names and fake research papers.
That's right.
They're like, wait, what? And they were desperately hunting around for finding who these people were that they'd never heard of, that were deep in their own field, and they realized this is completely fake. It made it all up.
Exactly.
Names and everything, which was really kind of pretty bizarre. So it means you can create like fake scientific papers that sound unbelievably plausible now, which is a whole other vector of kind of down there is madness rabbit hole.
In the pre chat GPT era, one of my favorite things to do with these text generating AIs was to have them write satirical articles in the style of news articles. One of the ones in particular that I don't have in front of me, so I can't read anything from it, but I had it write a piece in the style of Bloomberg, where economist Paul Krugman revealed that he was in fact a small horse, and that nobody had just been able to figure that out. And it was just the funniest, most ridiculous type of thing that nobody would ever write in real life, but which, again, like the ability to satirize anything through the kind of lens of whatever you want, like that's so fun. And I think that that's a reason why these AI technologies, particularly the creative stuff, is going to advance so fast, is going to be so disruptive, because unlike kind of the conversation we had earlier about cryptocurrency, there's no inherently financialized aspect to it that gets in the way. All it is useful and fun, and in many ways delightful. I think that it's delightful to see, it's like watching a cat give a talk about, nuclear physics, right? Like it might be entirely, correct. It might be entirely wrong. It kind of doesn't matter. The idea of a cat giving a talk about nuclear physics is itself inherently amusing. And I think that that's really what we want increasingly in times like today.
You've just given me an idea for a chat GPT question, which is describe the perspective of a cat stuck inside Schrodinger's box. Right?
That's a good one.
What is the cat experiencing? That would be totally fascinating. So I'm going to have to remember to try and plug that in and see what comes out of that. If we move on to the image generators and what you've been doing in PixelMind and what's now possible with Stable Diffusion, I saw a podcast with Imad and Peter Diamandis. Imad is the founder of Stability AI that created Stable Diffusion for folks on the call. He basically said the next version of this will be able to do real-time video manipulation and generative. You'll be able to say, hey, that character, have it have longer hair, and it'll generate the video for you on that model. When we pressed Imad on what industries might be disrupted, he basically said everything.
Yeah, he's right.
So give me a sense of, I know you've gone down this rabbit hole, so give us the benefit of some of that thinking. What are the industries that you think are first on the list to be disrupted, and how will they be disrupted?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the obvious industries up front are things like the art industry, for example. Effectively, what these image generators have done is they've taken what was, again, disruptive technologies take something that by nature of the amount of money or the amount of skill that's required are restricted in who can actually do them to a very small number of people. I would say that the art industry, the writing industry, all of these different creative professions, it's not that people can't do them, but they can't do them at a high enough level to attract attention. And I think that those are obviously the industries that will be disrupted first. But I would agree with Ahmad's take, and it's something I've increasingly been thinking about myself in terms of the implications. I think it's really hard to predict where this will wind up being most disruptive. The short answer is everywhere, and it's just a question of what comes first, as you asked. So I mean, let's
just pick the art industry, right?
Yep.
Okay, so and I'm giving you my perspective from a newbie perspective. For me, every time I look at an abstract painting, the title is "Man in Search of His Inner Self." I don't have the experiential nature of it like anybody who is an aficionado or an expert in that domain. But I think what you can end up doing is, say, in the same way you start off with captions that then generate an image, right? Now that becomes really powerful. I could imagine it having a screen and saying, take my mood off my devices and project something that enhances, reflects something to my mood. And now you have real-time adaptive art that's popping up. I'm struggling. So I see those kind of vectors, right? Where I'm struggling is, how does it affect the existing art industry? So if I understand it at all, there's some painter who has built a reputation over a number of years about doing things in a particular style, and that seems to me that would persist.
I agree,
because of the inherently human aspects of it. So which of the aspects of art that you think do get disrupted?
So, okay, I think this is it's a great question, and I think your perspective is pretty right on there. The value of art, more so I would argue than like literary works or stuff like that. The value of art in particular is the context that surrounds it. The reason why art has valuations that it does, when it has high valuations or low valuations, speaks to the cultural relevance, speaks to sort of the like I said, the context that actually surrounds that piece of artwork. So a piece of artwork that's created by Van Gogh is inherently more valuable, irrespective of what it looks like, than something that has been created by me, because the context that surrounds him as an artist and his journey and people who are interested in collecting that type of thing. Again, art is an inherently speculative thing. So when you're looking at it, I agree with you. I think that the context that surrounds existing artists and also new artists will remain the same. It's about building a following, it's about building a brand, and that will remain true. I think the part that's disruptive is that the number of people, or the types of people who have the ability to do that, I think will be broadened significantly. We're all sort of born with with like aesthetics, right? So the things that we personally like. And then there's a long road for most people who are going to do it towards developing the talent to actually express those aesthetics in ways that are marketable or kind of useful in an artistic sense. Certainly, I do not have the ability to do that. I can barely, I type very fast, but my handwriting is atrocious and my ability to do art is even worse. But I can take the aesthetics that I was born with and have developed over my life, and I can then use that to create artistic expression using these types of tools that might actually make it possible for me to have a career as an artist. So it takes the people who lose in this circumstance are people who have taken the time to develop the talent, but who have not yet effectively built a brand that insulates them from the disruption that's coming. Those are the people in large part who are disrupted here. And then there's a secondary effect, which is there's a very large market of people who don't really care about buying named art. They just want color on their walls, right? They just want a nice background on their phone. And that's something where there's a large multi-billion-dollar industry that exists today, where there are people who just produce that type of artwork. And I think that that's the place that gets truly disrupted. The industrial, because
now you just generate that. I mean,
just create it yourself.
Hallmark cards, right?
Yeah, like I approached a company called Mix Tiles about 6 months ago over email, and was like, hey, let me give you free art generation that you can put into your checkout process. And then rather than having to have people only come to you with images or pick from a very limited selection that you have licenses to, you can actually you can just let people create their own art. And the reason why I could do that for free was because the cost to do it is trivial. It's literally, at the time, it was about 6 cents per image generated, and right now it's about a quarter of a penny. And by this time next year, I'm sure it will be 10 to 100 times cheaper than it is today. So we're talking about effectively a cost of zero on a nominal basis, but there's intellectual property to be gained from those images and building up large libraries, especially if you can validate them commercially. Now, they didn't actually go with me. Instead, what they did was they made a deal with OpenAI, the company behind DALL-E 2, and they're doing it with them. But the point remains that the idea of sort of the industrial creation or mass production of artwork, like that's the industry that's going to be truly disrupted, because people can just make their own. And your ability to find something that somebody else has made that perfectly matches your aesthetics and desires versus the alternative of just creating it yourself and having essentially unlimited ability to do it with no cost and effectively instantly for the creation process, Like that's amazing and so
Hmm.
disruptive. It's not even funny.
Just utterly fascinating. So where do you, so art is one area, right? Let's talk about writing. I can see journalism getting quite disrupted by this because you could just say, hey, here's the facts around this summarized, and that's already happening. Most of the basic AP type articles are now generated via AI.
Bloomberg
right?
too. Yeah.
Bloomberg.
Bloomberg, like anything that comes out, like if something hits the newswire, for example, an event comes out, then there's typically an AI behind the scenes that takes that, immediately writes it, gets it out in 2 minutes, something you can't do with humans, but which you very much can do in this type of scenario. Writing will be more disrupted than art, I think, because, but I think the same thing holds true there, which is that, like I consider myself a writer. I don't write books, I write articles and I write papers and things like that. And to do so in a way that's non-derivative and that synthesizes information, but that comes to unique conclusions, I think that is something that's uniquely human, at least for the time being. But I also have been experimenting with and suspect that I will eventually be able to largely synthesize my perspective into something where I can insert new pieces of information into it, and then it really will write in my voice. And I've also been training an AI voice in my voice, because I do a lot of kind of podcast work. I do a daily news show for CoinDesk still. And that's entirely based on a script. So the technology there has improved probably 10 to 25 times over the last year and a half as I've been doing this. But we're still, I would say, about 10% shy of where it needs to be in order for me to have it truly be useful. And on the one hand, that's awesome. And on the other hand, that's terrifying because it means, again, like that my voice can be used if someone were to get access to this to say things that I would never say, and it creates all types of problematic scenarios that we can discuss later.
Well, but then there's the positive aspects of it, right? You could basically, we're at a point now, I think, where you could stuff all of Einstein's papers into one of these models and basically say, how would you approach that? And you'll get Einstein's thinking applied to a domain that he would not have conceived of, but it could be really validly applicable.
I think that to get to something like that, again, this is the question here is, can AI produce novel thinking given sufficient inputs?
Yeah.
I don't think so yet. I think that we'll get there, but there's a not well understood move that's going on right now towards integration of sort of neural scans, like with types of things like what Musk's Neuralink are working on, where you actually have like a brain to computer interface. I think at that point where you can actually start to simulate, where you can start to read and scan and then create sort of replicas of people's brains, I think at that point you'll get to the ability to simulate novel thinking. But I think until then you get the appearance of novelty, but in reality it is derivative, and in reality it's a cheap fake relative to a human. Like that won't always be true, but it's true today.
One of the things that for me, going back, mapping from the art stuff to the writing side, you take the chaos that's happening right now with the House of Representatives, right? And they can't elect a leader. What's fascinating to me is you could write a wonderful news article, you could write satire about that. The whole thing is a satire. But from a writer's perspective, or from a reader's perspective, I'm really fascinated to hear what Tom Friedman has to say about this, right? And because they were thinking about the different implications of it. Or what does Neil Ferguson think about this? And where does this go in terms of the overall slide of this? I think that side of it won't disappear soon. But something I'd love to hear ChatGPT's analysis of what's happening and see how would that compare with what's truly going on. And is there a way of leveraging that? I like your take on the fact that it's delightful and easy and non-financial, which keeps it pure in a sense. Right. So now, what other industries do you think get affected? Talk to us about education and learning. How do you think this stuff transforms there?
So I actually do have a list here that I've been putting together, and education certainly is on the list. Education is both something that will be disrupted and will eventually be, I think, significantly improved for individual users. Again, the cost of these types of artificial intelligence programs is so small that it takes things that are impractical in the real world, or out of reach for the vast majority of people, perhaps, but not sort of the ultra wealthy, and makes it so that you can actually have them at a level that was never conceivable before. So the concept of personalized learning, right? The concept of having constant access to a teacher, or to multiple teachers, or to many different personalities, the ability to, again, like, we're moving away from this standardized approach that I know for lots of people, myself included, I think performed very poorly, and which, really was a waste of time and an impediment to sort of the people who we would eventually become. And I think that you're talking about that in sort of the developed world, but as you move towards the kind of less developed parts of the world, I think that it's even more powerful there.
Yeah.
Because in many cases, education doesn't exist in a practical or useful format. And I think that, again, the democratization of those technologies is huge. The other side of it is, of course, things like homework, right? Like the ability to have an AI simply write something, and to have it write something that is in your voice, but is 2 grade letters higher than you would be able to achieve by yourself. Like, that's an existential threat to the way that the system works today.
I mean, that's going to break the system, because
it already is.
Different ways of assessing cognitive ability. Maybe we go back to in-person verbal testing, right?
Yeah.
Where you do live question Q&A back and forth. The one that occurred to me when I thought about this was, if you took all the Feynman lectures and put that through a machine, and then I could ask Feynman his opinion on this versus that, you'd probably get a really, really good, articulate, mostly accurate of what he would have said.
Yeah, I think that, again, the way to think about this is that it's never going to be as good as talking to the person, but it's better than not having access to something that can provide a mostly accurate facsimile of that person. So compared to the reality today, it's ages better than kind of what we're talking about here.
Have you ever heard of the monk Swedenborg?
I don't think so.
In the 1500s, a Swedish monk who had psychic abilities, wrote a set of, went through the Bible and created a set of filters for the Bible. So, for example, anything that has fire in it, you can just chuck it out, that verse is false. Anything that has a verb that mentions water is actually true. And he created this weird filter, and he wrote like 20 books analyzing the Bible from different perspectives. And when you look at the Bible with his filters in place, it's incredibly pure, beautiful stuff in terms of how human beings should operate, etc. I think something like that will be very powerful, because you can because he was very prolific. He wrote like 20, 30 books, right? So that's a big amount. You feed that through an engine and say, all right, give me a theological take with Swedenborg's voice on this. I think that becomes really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, like the reason why writing matters, I think the reason why culture matters, is because we don't know the answers to these questions. And so the idea that there's one canonical sort of way to think about any given thing, I think, is fundamentally wrong. And again, is a function of just, it's a function of, on the one side, centralizations of power are always very attractive to people who hold that power, and on the other side, just the practical realities of the world today. Artificial intelligence offers the path towards being able to have as many perspectives as you want, really, at essentially no cost, without needing the person to be alive. I think that there's huge advantages to be had there. And I think to the extent that you can expose yourself to a maximum number of those types of perspectives on any given topic that's interesting to you, you'll develop a much more well-rounded understanding, because rather than taking the one interpretation or two interpretations as gospel, you can instead compare and contrast the different things and find the particular ways of thinking about it that might not be represented by any one particular perspective, but which you form by nature of understanding all of those. And I mean, education is hard because of that, right? Education, like, we educate people about the things that we think that they need to know, but there are arguments and disagreements about what people need to know. I think a more interesting, or at least a simpler industry to take a look at is like the legal system, right? The legal system has one canonical set of rules that applies to literally every person in a particular jurisdiction. It is typically very, very convoluted. There's lots of nuance to it. There's lots of understanding, sidebars, precedents, Again, like the level of complexity that exists within this one set of rules that applies to everyone is overwhelming, even to professionals in the space.
Wow. You're right. This blows apart the legal system.
Well, it makes the legal system something that right now very efficiently serves the needs of people who have unlimited resources, and it turns it into something that serves the needs of anyone who actually has the need for it, because these costs and these economies of scale apply there. But I mean, even take something like the process of discovery, right? Like, a large company gets, is in a lawsuit with another large company, or a large company is in a lawsuit with an individual. I think we recently saw this. Actually, a great example is Alex Berenson recently sued Twitter. And they settled that case out of court. This was before Elon Musk purchased Twitter, and so he won some stuff. He won access to documents, and they did that in large part to avoid discovery. But I mean, let's actually draw back from the legal system for a second and just talk about the Twitter files, right? The Twitter files that exist out there today are essentially a bunch of largely formerly kind of left-leaning journalists who have now been disavowed by their former compatriots and turned into right-wing people, because that's what the left says that anybody who they disagree with is. And what they're doing is they're doing like search queries through Twitter's like email system and stuff like that, in the same way that you would do discovery. The problem of it is that there's so much there that the idea of doing that with just search terms and having, maybe 7 or 8 different people spend, weeks and weeks of time looking through this means that you're inevitably going to miss the vast majority of what's interesting in there, because it might not be as simple as searching for, a particular term. If what you can do is you can take that data set, all of that information, and again, imagine this in discovery as well, and then you can have the AI give it a brief and have it look through and highlight all of the pieces, not based on search terms, but based on the actual results and kind of the goal of the thing, then this takes a process that right now costs hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions of dollars to complete in any sort of significantly complex scenario, and makes it something where a person who has access to this technology can do it inherently and can do it effectively with no cost and with no additional representation. They just have to be able to direct the AI to accomplish that type of thing. So that's one side of it. Another side of it is, again, like now, I mean, there quickly comes an argument here, which is that how much of this process do we want to automate? Where is human discretion valuable, and where is human discretion actually a distortion of the system in a way that's negative for the system as a whole and individuals in general? I don't know the answer to that, but we can predict very easily that is going to be that's going to be one of the areas that I think will be most significantly disrupted in the near future.
I could imagine this being incredibly powerful for policy formulation.
Yes, also
right?
that.
Because you could say, hey, give me the top 10 implications if I implement this policy, and what would you do differently to mitigate those negative side effects that you didn't think about, right? That I think one other, as we were talking about this, another one that occurs to me is small claims court.
Yes.
Right. You could essentially have 2 people in a video offer their testimony about why somebody hit me in a fender bender and why they should versus they shouldn't. And an AI could, with image recognition, facial feature, et cetera, plus voice analysis, kind of go, yeah, we're going to go with that one, and award damages.
Yeah, I mean, so we quickly get into a very dangerous area here, which is, again, how first off, what kind of AI is it? Who trained it? Who controls it? Because if you look at something like ChatGPT, I had a conversation with it yesterday about inflation, and then a conversation with it, and again, it's not connected to the internet. It doesn't have contemporary knowledge of the last year or two, but it has a very good understanding of what's come before. And what you'll find is that because of who controls and who created ChatGPT, it's very hard to get it to acknowledge realities that I think that normal people would acknowledge if those realities present some type of an optical danger to the company who supplies ChatGPT. And I think that you'll find that with lots and lots of things. To the extent that something is controversial is to the extent that ChatGPT doesn't really want to talk to you about it, because they know that somebody is going to take a screenshot of it, put it up there and say, see, this is what OpenAI thinks. Of course, in reality, so I mean, that's the question, is like, who controls these things? What are they actually designed to do? And I think the result of that is how much power can we really entrust into them to do that? Because what you wind up with is, again, I was talking about how my big concerns in the world today are centralizations of power.
Yeah.
AI presents enormous centralization implications. And if it's not created in ways that are transparent and egalitarian, then I think that you wind up in a very scary place pretty quick.
We've been, as I get ready to get publish the second edition of EXO, the book, we actually, we were struggling with what's the definition of an EXO, because it used to be one way we thought about changing it. So we literally fed it in the ChatGPT. The resulting output was so good that we kind of went, that's the old definition, and here's the new definition, here's what ChatGPT, and the zeitgeist amongst those three gives you a really compelling view of it.
Yeah.
And what we're doing now is putting each chapter through it and saying, give us a paragraph summary of that chapter, so that we can use that as text marketing. I've spent 3 years updating this damn book, right? I wish I could redo it now, given this damn thing that's just appeared at the end of it, because if I'm shaking my 3 years wasted, and it probably would do it in a better way anyway. In fact, we should do that. We should actually rewrite the book with ChatGPT
next time. I would say next time. Next time do that. Yeah, I mean, the problems that still exist today in the large language models largely have to do with the ability to retain information. Without getting technical about it, like they're not great at longer term memory. I think that the actual limitation on, it's not ChatGPT, it's a larger one than that, is about like a paragraph. Sorry, is about like a chapter. Like 5 or 6 pages. That's about how much it can actually hold. And so what you find yourself doing when you try and do this, I recently just rewrote that radio drama with ChatGPT. And it was much, much, much better. It was much more fun to do it too. And it was much easier, but it still has the same coherency problems, which is that it loses track. So I think that your timing on this is perfect. It's good to mention it in the book, but I think the next time that you rewrite the book, you'll be able to basically feed in, here's version 1, here's version 2, here are my new assumptions, create the new version of it. Exactly. So I think your timing is good. Don't beat yourself up too much there.
Yeah. All right. I'll take that. All right. What other industries do you think are massive targets for the new models, AI models that are emerging?
Yeah, I think the mental health is also going to be a really significant one in ways that are not immediately apparent, but which again quickly are become obvious once you start thinking about the cost implications. Again, like mental health, especially when you're talking about actually working with therapists. My sister is a PhD therapist, and works with patients, and the cost that's associated with that is significant, and it acts as a limiting factor for people. And then also the person who you're speaking to might not necessarily be the right person for you. They might not do things in the way that you want. And so again, imagine a future where, and then also of course there are access issues, right? You speak to them at a certain time, it's typically regularly scheduled because it's impractical to have constant access to them for a whole variety of reasons. So AI changes that. It means that if you want, Sigmund Freud to be, your therapist, and have access to them at any time and be able to talk to them and get their perspective on things, then you can do that. And I think that again, there will always be significant value to speaking to real people who have real personal context and aren't amalgamations of sort of theory and kind of the collective unconscious that exists out there in any particular area. So it's not that goes away, but it is that the number of people who actually can gain access to these tools goes up exponentially. And I think that that's helpful. But again, you get to the centralization problem, which is that who's creating it? What's happening to the data that's being fed into it? Are they actually trying to help you? Or is this actually something that isn't trying to help you, but is just kind of posing as that? It opens up kind of a Pandora's box of both amazing opportunity and empowerment, but also incredible danger. There are other areas, I think, like healthcare. Like there are many AI technologies or just kind of automated technologies, not even necessarily AI, that can allow for diagnosis to happen. Again, imagine never having to go to the doctor again because you have sensors, that you can put them on at home, and then you can.
There was a study that came out literally yesterday or the day before, where they ran medical diagnoses through an engine like this, and it turned out that the doctor's opinion was 93% copied by the AI.
Yeah.
So that means that an AI is 93% as effective as a doctor already. And this is before you get into the mess that about 1/3 of medical diagnoses are wrong anyway.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like insane what we're going to be able to do with healthcare.
Yeah. I mean, there's this bias towards believing, like, so humans, like our brains are inherently lazy, and what we want is we want someone to tell us the truth, and then we want to believe that person, right? And so there's this bias towards assuming that experts are correct. And I think that that's both a strength and a weakness for AI, is that because they're going to be trained in large part initially off of what real doctors think, we will get the same types of errors. But at the same time, you won't get an error because somebody didn't drink coffee that morning and is feeling a little bit off and misses something that they typically would have caught. That will you'll solve that problem, but you keep many of the distortions that exist within the system today.
My favorite way of talking about this is to make the point that there are 2,500 cancer research papers published per day today. I mean, if you're an oncologist, you don't have a hope in hell of keeping track of all of that. You're going to need an AI to support that massive amount of data collection and research studies and clinical trials that are going on a nonstop basis. And if somebody comes in with pancreatic cancer, then boom, this is the current today's version of what you think about. And I think that's a huge area for opportunity there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that one thing that's worth talking about is also the impact on kind of military conflicts and stuff like that, right? I think that this is also an area that we've seen sort of the US military in particular, but militaries around the world, really, to the better funded ones, pushing towards taking humans out of the loop. And one of the things that's been interesting to me in both a way that I think is positive and also negative is that I have very little concern that we're going to see governments around the world try to take action against these types of artificial intelligences, right? Insofar as just like general, not talking about the military context. And I believe that because if you look at the kind of state of drone usage, right, manned or unmanned, we're starting to see swarm attacks of small drones, not just kind of the larger stuff that the US military has been using. There was an attack in Russia, I believe, during the Ukraine conflict over the last month or two that was sort of indicative of that. And there have been a number of other things like that. There's nobody talking on the world stage about banning the use of autonomous technologies or AIs that have kill capacities. There's not a single conversation about that. It's not discussed in the US. It's not discussed anywhere. And that is very concerning to me, but it also speaks to, again, just how far behind kind of everybody is as far as the capabilities here, because this has been true for a long time. And we can't even agree on that.
In fact, I happen to know from my Singularity days that the US military has if you're going to give the order to kill somebody, that kill order has to come from a human being.
Yeah.
I think but that doesn't mean that other countries are going to follow and inherit that at all. In fact, the opposite. There's no compunction of saying if person X crosses this line, just kill them, and that's going to happen.
And the fact that the US, despite having that policy in place today, is not arguing for a treaty on a global basis that standardizes that. I think it's very hard for countries to argue against that. And yet the fact that nobody is arguing in favor of it makes it such that I think that's a reality of the current technologies rather than some ideological or philosophical stance that it is correct to have humans in the loop. I think it's just it's a momentary reality. Were it something that was philosophical or ideological on the part of the US, you would see the US championing a treaty that says no autonomous drones, that are weaponized or have kill capacity, can be used. And again, I think that were something like that to come up, it would be at the very least a real conversation about it. And the conversation doesn't exist. So like that's again, like the problem. So wars are always started by powerful people who have control over people, over less powerful people, right? Those less powerful people tend to then fight the wars. And you can look at the history of conflicts in the United States and the current problems that it has with sort of its personnel situation around the military. And what you see is that actually you have to have buy-in to a certain extent from the population in order to do that, because the powerful people aren't going to put themselves at risk or their people at risk. They want to put someone else at risk. And I think that AI is colonizing Mars, right? AI for the military is colonizing Mars for Elon Musk. It's a way to escape that reality and to try to say, well, we don't need to actually have wars that we can convince people are righteous wars or wars that are worth fighting. Instead, what we should do is we should try to obsolete the person from that and replace it with AI. We are not there yet in any way.
We've had this discussion about going to Mars before at NASA, and the general consensus was, you can create a hermetically sealed bubble for people to live in. One bad guy with a pin and you're all toast, right? The downsides are so ridiculous. And the consensus out of that discussion was that we're way, way more likely to send robots and avatars to explore space than human beings. And the timescale is long enough that we better solve our problems here before figuring out how to export our problems elsewhere.
Yeah, completely. So
Cool.
I'm reminded of one thing, and then I realized that we are basically out of time here.
Yes.
So circling back to the metaverse and circling back to, again, the original comments that I made about sort of government centralizations of power and what you talked about as far as the sort of obsoleteness of the nation state in sort of the modern era. That actually is the use case that I eventually see for metaverses in a meaningful sense, is this concept of network states rather than geographically bordered states, I think is really powerful. And I think that what you find is that were the choice yours to determine who you paid taxes to, what services you were provided, and if that, like the internet, were not something that was bound by geography and was rather more of an ideological or affinity, affiliation, then I think that you would have a better world. You would have a world that would allow people to have choice, to have exit, and those concepts I think are very important. And I think that the metaverse really can come into play there by providing, the utility of physical spaces, the utility of geographic cohesion, without requiring that people live their entire lives in that. I recently moved a couple of years ago at this point up to Oregon, live in a rural area. My entire life is on the internet. So it's not like I have any affinity to the place that I live. It's not about that. It provides me with the sort of, the precursors that I need: a very fast internet connection, good relative services, relatively low amount of government intruding on my life. But were the option to pick where I actually wanted to pay taxes to, be a citizen to, then I would not pick here.
I believe we have the beginnings of that, because right now you can choose to live in the Apple or Google or Amazon ecosystem and pay dues and fees and subscription fees there. I think that's the very beginnings of it, but I do agree with you. That's overall where we're going. All right, we're running out of time. Adam Levine, thank you so much for just an awesome conversation. I've got like 30 questions to follow up, but we'll figure out, we'll do a separate session delving into some of those. This has been the Salim Ismail Podcast, thinking about how do you transform humanity and how do we navigate from a scarcity-based Mad Max world to an abundance-based Star Trek world, or any of the other labels you want to put out. Thank you so much for being with us, Adam.
Thank you, Salim.